China. The nation constitutes 1.4 billion people. And if you follow the news closely, that currently the China today, it's seeking much greater ambitions. And when we talk about this economic ambition, of course, and also this political ambition under the current administration. Now, how much do we understand when we talk about China's economic agenda? And also, what about the word urbanization? And we understand that for centuries, that try to modernize the urbans or try to modernize the rural areas has been one of the top priorities for many leaders in China. But how to really accomplish and how can we understand that today people in China are quite satisfied and also looking forward to see what the future holds? And what about the people who live in this or among those underdeveloped areas? Well, in this conversation, we're going to talk about all of them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Mr. Eli Friedman. Mr. Friedman has a PhD in sociology from the University of California in Berkeley and has been on the faculty of ILR School since 2011. Again, he's the author of the new book, which is entitled The Urbanization of People, the Politics of Development, Labor Markets, and the Schooling in the Chinese City. Well, Mr. Friedman, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me.
Well, again, Mr. Friedman, I have to say that the more I read about your book and the more questions I started to craft before our interview, but let's go to your book right away. I want to read something to you, and let's start from there. This is what you have from the introduction of the book, and I quote, "China's large cities have drawn in many millions of rural migrants in the recent decades and continuously exceeded self-imposed population limits, and while their economic expansion has been underwritten by mass inflows of the pliable and cheap labor." Now, help us with better understanding. We know that when we talk about this migration among the cities in China, for example, we'll look at Beijing, look at Shanghai, and all those major booming cities. Why is it important for us to understand this, what you called the self-imposed population limits, and what are you trying to say in there?
Yeah, so for many years, the Chinese central government has had concerns about overpopulation in the cities. This is something that I think is reflected in popular discourse for people who've spent time in China. When you're in cities, it is common to hear this refrain that China has too many people, that the cities have to establish certain kinds of obstacles to permanent settlement. Otherwise, they would be completely overrun by the hundreds of millions of rural people who are more impoverished, who would want to come into the cities for the economic opportunities, as well as critically for the better social services that they enjoy in those cities. And so there's also a political component to this. The central government looking at the development of cities and other places in the global south has seen the expansion of slums, of unregulated spaces in cities, which they see as possible breeding grounds for political, anti-state political sentiment. And so they want to prevent that from happening. Now, I think that there's a lot in that which is commendable, certainly unobjectionable. You don't want, nobody likes living in slum conditions with inadequate facilities, and so being able to ensure that you have the resources and the infrastructure necessary to absorb big inflows of people, I think, is a reasonable policy aim. But when I specifically talk about the exceeding their own the self-established limits, the central government going back to the 1990s began establishing these population limits, particularly for the so-called first-tier cities. It's the clearest, especially in Beijing and Shanghai. And they've set these goals or these limits, and then the cities have continually exceeded them, and more people have come in. And so one of the things that I was looking at was that dynamic going back a couple of decades. And what I really identify is that in 2014, in both Beijing and Shanghai, and to some extent in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, though a lesser extent in the southern cities, they really begin taking pretty decisive action to try to limit the inflows of people, and they are quite successful. And by 2017, the city of Beijing, its population is shrinking in absolute terms, which is, and in part because of very low birth rates within the cities, and also they've made it very, very difficult for people to move in from rural areas into the cities. Now, the very success of those programs poses new challenges for those cities, because when your population is shrinking, then you have other kinds of issues that you have to deal with. But that's, in any event, that's the basic dynamic that I'm looking at.
Mr. Friedman, again, I traveled among the cities in China very often, but one thing I noticed, again, by having the conversations with the people in Beijing, in Shanghai, and again, all the cities that you mentioned, more and more Chinese citizens believe that Beijing or Shanghai today, in the year of 2024, tend to be more political. So in other words, people no longer consider Beijing as one of the, what we say, the vibrant cities for business opportunities or for economic opportunities. And again, we're looking at this political change and also this political shift. But meanwhile, you also mentioned in the book, it's something called National New Urbanization Plan. I want to get to the next question is, by seeing, again, hypothetically, if Beijing were to become more political centered city, how should we understand this National New Urbanization Plan, and how is that going to bring more rejuvenation or even more energy for the cities that who are not being urbanized? What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, one of the essential features of this National New Urbanization Plan, which was implemented years 2014 to 2020, was precisely to redirect urbanization away from those super extra large cities, is the terminology that they use. So that refers to cities that have a so-called urban district population of more than 5 million people. And, you know, the numbers can be a little bit confusing because people think of Beijing as being a city with, 23, 24 million people, and Shanghai even more than that. The urban district population refers just to the people who are living in the central districts. So it's a relatively small number of cities. Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Chengdu would also be included in that. And I believe Wuhan also passed the mark, and maybe Nanjing. So it's a relatively small number of cities, but what they were trying to accomplish in this National New Urbanization Plan was to divert more people away from those extra large cities and into the small and medium cities. So rather than having people move from, say, rural Henan to Beijing or Shanghai, they want them to move from rural Henan to their local county city, right? Or a smaller, say, Luoyang, or a smaller city like that in Henan, rather than going to these, tier 1 superstar cities. So this is very much part of the plan. And again, I think that there is some good justification for that. Not everybody can live in Beijing or Shanghai. If you look at countries that have an excessive amount of the population in a single city, it can cause problems. You see this with Seoul in South Korea, or with London in the UK. It can make the cities too expensive, too crowded, polluted, etc. So I think that there's something justifiable there. The problem, and this is one of the focuses of my book, is that you also have this very uneven distribution of fiscal resources between these cities. So looking at schooling, which is what I focus on, but it can be looking at healthcare, looking at pensions. If you're in those first tier cities, your access to social services will be much better. You'll be able to access better quality services than if you move to those smaller cities. So when the central government says you can't move to the very, very large cities, you can only go to these smaller and medium-sized cities, in essence, what they're saying is your children are not going to have access to the same kind of education that the children who happen to be born in Beijing have access to. So it does create, I think, the possibility for some ongoing social and economic inequalities.
When you talk about economic inequalities, now let's bring another piece of facts into our conversation regarding this job opportunities. I mean, again, we know that today, particularly in Beijing, in Shanghai, all those major cities, the employment opportunities are rather competitive. I mean, again, we're seeing the slowness in Chinese economy, but meanwhile, we'll continue to see the number rises among the graduates in China. I mean, again, young people are very much looking forward to higher education, but meanwhile, they're very much concerned regarding the future after graduation. So again, Mr. Friedman, go back to your book and go back to our conversation. How do you think that today that China is handling, or even is possibly trying to figure out the tangible or practical solutions to balance between the unemployment rate and also this education desire among the younger generations? I mean, again, in China, that's a reality. I mean, I think it's a reality for everywhere that in order to get a high-paying job and college degree, it's a must. But meanwhile, the China faces a critical and harsh condition that the unemployment rate among the younger generations are skyrocketing. Again, going back to your research, what do you say to that? And also, what are your comments based on this imbalance for that?
That is a great question and a complicated one that I didn't really get into in the book, because this really skyrocketing youth unemployment actually happened after my research was completed. And just for your listeners, as a bit of background, last year the government released these numbers that were pretty startling, which was that youth unemployment was over 20%. I believe 21 and change, and that created a lot of media commentary, and subsequently, I think the government didn't do itself any favors by stopping the reporting of youth unemployment, because they said they had to reconfigure the way it was calculated, which many people, interpreted as them sort of just saying, well, this is bad news, we don't want to report it. They subsequently changed the metrics and came out with it, and the youth unemployment rate is still quite high, I think around 14%, even using their new calculation. So this is a really pressing issue. And there's a lot of interlocking problems that we see in cities. Intense competition just to get into universities. And again, the top tier universities are all located in very large cities. Beijing alone has many of them, but Shanghai, Guangzhou, places like that have others. Students want to get into that. Their families want them to go to those top tier universities, and you can understand that. Upon graduating, though, they now face this very intense labor market where finding any employment is not a guarantee. If they do find employment, then they're confronted with the imbalance between what's happening in the labor market and what's happening in the housing market. Because if you look at those top tier cities in Beijing, the income to housing cost ratio is among the worst in the world, significantly worse than, American cities that I'm familiar with, like Los Angeles or New York. And so that presents even more pressure for young people. So a lot of, both the government and to some extent, young people themselves have been sort of saying, well, maybe they should not be in these very large cities, right? Maybe we could try to figure out a way to create job growth not centered in the extra large cities and located more in small and medium cities in the interior or the western parts of the country. And there's been a lot of success at that. If you look over the last 20 years, and this is going back even to before Xi Jinping was in office, there have been efforts to develop the western parts of the country. This was a big initiative for Hu Jintao. And a lot of those interior cities over the last 20 years have been growing more quickly. Places like Wuhan, Changsha, Chengdu, Chongqing, etc. There's still sort of regional imbalances, even between provincial capitals, places that I just named, and smaller county level cities. And, the question of whether you can create not just economic dynamism, but decent jobs for people, I think really does remain an open question. We've seen discussion in the last year or so, Xi Jinping's new slogan around new productive forces. People are still kind of interpreting exactly what that means, but it certainly looks like the government is putting a lot of investment in advanced manufacturing. The most famous example being the electric vehicles that China has been quite successful at, and as well as much of the supply chain that goes into the production of that. I'm still not convinced, that we'll have to see whether the kinds of industries that they're investing in are going to be able to absorb enough labor, right? Because a lot of these things are very capital intensive and technology intensive, and are not necessarily going to be able to provide decent jobs at a large scale for lots of young people. So we'll have to see how that develops, but that's the challenge that they face.
Mr. Friedman, let's talk about the schooling in the Chinese city. I know that for this book that you did extensive research regarding the schools among the cities. Put in a very simple way, why is it critical and essential for us to understand the changes among the schools in the cities in China? I mean, again, we know that education is critical. I mean, again, it's not just about the younger generations, it's for everyone, and particularly in China. We've seen for decades that China has been actively putting out education reform and policies, and again, from the pre-K and all the way to college, etc. What did you notice among your research for this book that when we talk about the schoolings in the cities, and how does that relate to this, what we called a national new urbanization plan? Your thoughts?
One of the things that I propose in the book, which I think is hopefully not too controversial, is that we can get some sense about what future social and economic inequalities will look like if we look at schools today. Because what happens in schools gives you some sense of the future. It's not a perfect sense, right? But you can begin to see the trajectories that children's lives might be put onto if you go into schools, and even primary schools. I was mostly in primary schools, some middle schools as well. So that's the kind of methodological choice that I'm making. And I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, but China does have pretty severe educational inequalities. We can see inequalities between urban areas and rural areas. This is something that has been extensively studied, particularly by a guy named Scott Rozelle and the Rural Education Action Project at Stanford University. They've done some great work on that. I was interested in looking at not exactly rural-urban inequalities, but the inequalities within cities for people who were born in those cities and have urban residency as compared to the children of rural migrants that are coming into those cities, so inhabiting the spaces of the cities, but somehow not incorporated into the public system. And one of the things that I found was that it is very unequal. That access to the high quality public education systems that they have in Beijing and Shanghai, places like that, which it should be noted are quite good public systems. And if you look just at the public systems in those cities, they can compete, with many of the best public systems around the world. But they're not very inclusive. So you have, in some places, up to a third of the population that is living in those cities, in the case of Shenzhen, even more than a third, that is not guaranteed access to those systems and is kept into these less good but fully privatized system of education. Now, the way that they sometimes bring rural children into the public system, I think only increases the dynamic, the sort of inequality producing dynamics, because they will allow children to come in who already have very high test scores, because that makes the public schools look better if they can incorporate students that have higher test scores. If the parents have well-paying jobs, if the parents are participating in the local social insurance plans, if the parents own property in those local markets, that will make it easier for their children to get into public schools. But all of those things suggest that you might not be an urban resident, but you're doing pretty well economically, right? And so it's giving a leg up to people who probably already have something of a leg up, which to me suggests a kind of inequality increasing dynamic. Now, you asked a question about how things have changed in recent years. And one of the things that's important to note, as with many things, the central government is keenly aware of this problem. I think has done a reasonably good job identifying it and proposing certain kinds of solutions. That's what's happening at the central level, but they haven't actually taken the steps to ensure that it filters down to the city governments where education policy is actually implemented. So going back to the early 2000s, 2001, you can see that the Ministry of Education has adopted this policy called the two primaries. And the two primaries means that the children of migrant workers should be primarily put into public schools, and that the financing for their education should be primarily borne by the receiving areas, by the cities. And they established that as a general policy goal, which is admirable, and have other policies where the rhetoric is really around educational equalization has been another key slogan of the Ministry of Education. What the central government has not done is enacted the fiscal reforms that would allow that plan to be realized, right? Which would allow people to access good public education wherever they're living. And so I kind of see, what's happening at the rhetorical level at the central government as being positive. When you get down to the local governments are sort of saying, well, we're not legally obligated to provide education to the children of migrants. Why should we? We have other kinds of priorities, right? And so you can look in Beijing over the last, 20 some odd years. They spent, on the Olympics, I think they spent more than 40 billion US dollars alone, just putting on the Olympics. They have not spent even a fraction of that on providing education to rural migrants because they weren't obligated to, right? So they have this money and they have the freedom to spend it on other things. And oftentimes it's just not their top priority. And so one of the consequences of the central government not taking more assertive action to ensure greater equity is that if left on alone, these kind of inequality producing tendencies will persist.
Mr. Friedman, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's go back to your book. You put two concepts together in the book. One is called capital. Another one is the concept of labor. And again, I want to read something to you. Let's dive into our conversation. And I quote, "Capital and labor are mutually constitutive," and a cliche, but a relevant one. Capital can reduce but never eliminate its dependence on labor. Cities must admit population if they are to grow economically. How should we understand today that when we talk about this economic agenda or even this political ambition in China, in terms of capital and labor? And does that mean that migrants that moved from rural areas or underdeveloped cities or areas to the major cities, and they're actually bring greater contributions to the cities, and overall it's much greater contribution to the Chinese economy? So what are you trying to say from that perspective?
Yeah. I think the rhetoric is quite contradictory, right? So we've already talked about the way that the extra large cities have for a long time said, well, we have to barricade ourselves against these masses of migrant workers that are coming in. If they had actually been successful at that, going back to the kind of the eve of economic reform, say in the 1980s and the 1990s, there's no conceivable way that these large, very, very wealthy cities could exist in their present form without that labor. Now, this is very clear, I think, in the Guangdong cities, which are very manufacturing driven, right? So if you think about the rise of a place like Shenzhen, how is that possible without a company like Foxconn, right? Of course, now there's Tencent and these, kind of tech companies there, which are a different dynamic, but that wouldn't have happened without first that low end, very labor intensive form of manufacturing that began developing really in the 1990s. So, when I was first doing research in Shenzhen in 2004, 2005, you had a single Foxconn facility there that had 400,000 workers, right? One factory. And so that is the thing that drove Shenzhen's development. That was only possible because you had 400,000 relatively impoverished people in rural areas who are willing to move to those cities, who are willing to accept pretty low wages and to advance this form of economic development. Now, it looks a little bit different in places like Beijing or Shanghai, which are a little bit less dependent on that low-end manufacturing. But even if you think about the construction industry, and real estate has been a pillar of the economies in Shanghai and Beijing, those are completely dependent on the labor of rural migrants who are paid bad wages, oftentimes not paid at all. The non-payment of wages is quite endemic in the construction industry. And so when you go to these cities, you go to Pudong and you see all the tall, fabulous skyscrapers. One way of looking at that is saying, oh, this is the kind of like the business acumen of Chinese bankers or international finance. Yes, that is true. Embodied in those buildings is also the labor of all of those migrant workers who built them, and the very low wages kind of subsidize their ability to build all this infrastructure quite quickly. But today it looks a little bit different, right? Because the cities have changed a lot. But if you look at the sources, the sectors of employment that have been growing most quickly, beginning in 2019, really accelerating during the pandemic, is all of this platform-based work, right? So the food delivery workers working for Meituan or Ulama, people delivering packages for Jingdong or for Alibaba. Those are the fastest sources of employment in general. And if you go, and I've done some research in the sector of the economy as well, these are almost exclusively rural migrants. Go talk to anybody who lives in one of these cities. This was very, very true during the pandemic. They quite literally cannot survive without the labor of those people that are moving packages, moving food around the city, that are driving their taxis, et cetera. So, you know, it is a simple point, but one of the consequences of this is you see this kind of contradictory dynamic within cities, but also within the polity more general, where there's this almost kind of schizophrenic understanding of whether China has too many people or not enough people. So for a very long time, when China had the strictly enforced birth control policies that limited most people to one child, there was this rhetoric that, again, China has too many people. We have to take these extreme steps. Otherwise, we would suffer severe overpopulation. And that, in the span of a couple of years, just turned on a dime. Right. And now the rhetoric is very clearly China doesn't have enough people.
That's right.
And the central government, local governments are taking steps to say, how can we encourage you to have more children? Now, why is that happening? Economists are very clear that it is very difficult to expand your economy when your population is shrinking. This is something, you know, that places like Japan have been dealing with for a longer time. And I think people understand that China, if it doesn't do something about the demographic situation, it will impact the economic situation. This is really just a reflection of the point that China benefited, in a sense, for a long time from having all of these people, also workers, that really powered the economy. And without all of those people, it's going to be a lot more difficult to find new sources of growth.
Of course, Mr. Eli, I agree with you 100%. I mean, again, China today is facing one of the major crises that regarding to population decline. I mean, of course, that's why the policy has been changing and also flipping back and forth. Now, again, let's go back to your book, wrap up our conversation. The book is called The Urbanization of People, The Politics of Development, Labor Markets, and the Schooling in the Chinese City. Let's just say for anyone that who's not familiar with the urbanization in China and also this labor markets and schooling in China, what would you expect the readers to take away from your book when they finish reading the last chapter of your book? I mean, again, we talk about China. It's a nation that is rather competitive with the US and of course is generating much greater noises around the world. But when we look at this economic agenda, we look at this political shift, and of course, we're looking at this competition between US and China. So how would you like the readers to understand and also appreciate that research and the work you did? I want to hear your final thoughts.
Well, as an American, of course, this question of U.S.-China competition is something that I think about a lot. It has affected me personally, not surprisingly. I came up as a researcher and a student in a period of time when the U.S. and China were getting along much better. It was there was a growing number of Americans going to China, and of course, the reverse was also true. And exchanges in various spheres, in the labor movement, which I've been involved in academia, certainly in business, all of these things were kind of expanding, and it felt like there was kind of limitless possibilities for cooperation. That has changed very dramatically, beginning even before Donald Trump was elected, but accelerated certainly by the election of Donald Trump. And really now it is a bipartisan agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats in the U.S. to confront China, and the Communist Party in China is very, enthusiastic about confronting the United States as well, which has made it, for me personally, almost impossible to go back and do research in China, which, I experience as a real loss. So, of course, it is something that I think about a lot. It is something that saddens me, and I think is not inevitable, but here we are. One of the things that I oftentimes will talk about when speaking to Americans, and of course the book is written in English, and so people outside of China are the primary audience for it. Although the book has recently been translated into Chinese by National Taiwan University Press, which I'm very pleased about. But so one of the things that I like to draw attention to is that despite this intense conflict, which is oftentimes posed as a kind of a civilizational difference, right? Or, you know, it's capitalism and freedom versus communism and authoritarianism, or however it's presented, that we actually have similar social problems in a lot of ways. Now, the specific manifestations of them are quite different. But this question of educational inequality, which is, I think, quite severe in China, really resonates in a lot of ways with the experience in the United States. Now, in the United States, it is racialized in a way that it is not in China, just because of the very different histories and demographic characteristics of our two societies. But this idea that dependent on where you're born, who your parents were, that you might have access to really good public schools, or you might have access to really, really bad and inferior public schools that will not prepare you for the labor market. It will not prepare you for life, for political participation. Like, that's the thing that I think Americans can understand, because our society is characterized by those kinds of problems as well. And so part of my hope, and this is not at all explicit in the book, I have no idea whether people will take this away from reading it, but it is to show that, yes, we have these major political differences. Those are real political differences. I'm not saying that they're irrelevant, but fundamentally, the things that motivate people and the kinds of social problems that human beings face in their day-to-day experience are actually quite similar. And we should really be focusing on how to deal with those problems rather than figuring out how to antagonize each other kind of in these geopolitical games.
Well, you said it 100%. Again, not only me, but also I believe our viewers and audience agree with you too, that at this moment, we're looking at the tension between the two countries. And the last thing we want is to have more tensions and a much greater pressure placed upon on both countries and the leaders. It's really, and then at the end of the day, it's the citizens that we really need to think about. How can we come up with the better solutions so we can have, again, not just the scholar like you to come back to China, but also we're able to send scholars internationally and go to US, continue this mutual and also this reliable friendship. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Mr. Eli Friedman. Again, Mr. Friedman has a PhD in sociology, and of course, I strongly encourage everyone to go online and to check out this new book, which is called The Urbanization of People, the Politics of Development and Labor Markets and the Schooling in the Chinese City. Well, Mr. Friedman, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention, not just about the affairs in China, but also the matters around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Phil. It's been my pleasure.
Very good, Mr. Friedman.